He bought the girl with the sack on her head for $5 silver, and in doing so, he bought himself a reckoning. Dakota Territory. Autumn, 1878. The world was a canvas of bruised purples and dying yellows, the air sharp with the promise of a winter that would forgive no weakness. In the center of this unforgiving landscape was a trading post, a carbuncle of mud-chinked logs and desperate men huddled on the fringe of civilization. It smelled of wet wool, cheap whiskey, and despair. Elias Kane felt the place more than he saw it, a low thrum of misery that resonated with the hollow space in his own chest. He was a man carved from the surrounding mountains, tall and broad, with a silence that was older and heavier than the pines. A filigree of puckered scar tissue traced a path from his temple down his left cheek, a permanent memory of heat and loss that kept his words few and his eyes perpetually fixed on the horizon. He had come for salt, flour, and coffee, the simple necessities for a winter of solitude. He wanted nothing more. He expected nothing less. Then the man arrived. His name was Silas Blackwood, though Elias did not know it then. He rode a fine black horse that was too clean for the mud, and his coat was trimmed with fur that spoke of wealth earned without sweat. He carried himself with the arrogant assurance of a man who believed the world was his to own, piece by piece. Behind his horse, tethered by a coarse rope, stumbled a woman. Or what was presumed to be a woman. Her form was slight, made shapeless by a drab, worn dress, and her belly was swollen with the unmistakable curve of late-term pregnancy. But her head, from the neck up, was entirely encased in a filthy burlap sack, cinched tight with a leather thong. She did not cry out. She did not struggle. She simply moved as she was pulled, a spectre of shame in the grim afternoon light. Blackwood dismounted with a flourish, pulling the rope so the woman nearly fell. A few grimy trappers and listless prospectors looked up from their doldrums, their curiosity piqued. "Gentlemen," Blackwood announced, his voice smooth and cold as a river stone. "A bit of misfortune has become your opportunity." He gestured to the woman with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "I find myself burdened. This asset has become inconvenient." A low, cruel chuckle rumbled in his chest. "She's hardy. A good worker when she's not in this condition. But my business takes me east, and I've no room for excess baggage." He held up a hand. "For the paltry sum of $5, she is yours. Her labor, her future, and the whelp she carries with her." A bargain. A sickening silence fell over the small crowd. It was the silence of men who had seen much but preferred to see little. They saw a pregnant woman being sold like livestock, her face hidden under a bag of shame, and they looked away, back into their drink, back into the mud. It was not their trouble. But for Elias, it was. He saw not an asset, but a reflection of a world he had tried to escape. He saw the strong preying on the weak, the very thing that had sent him into the deep woods years ago. He looked at the woman's hands, cuffed by the rope. They were raw and chapped, but her fingers were long and slender. They were not the hands of a field worker. He looked at the slight tremor in her shoulders, the only sign of the terror she must be feeling. In that tremor, he saw the ghost of his wife, and in the swell of her belly, the ghost of his daughter. The hollow space in his chest ached with a sudden, sharp pain. He had failed to protect them. A fire had taken them, a cruel, indiscriminate act of fate. This was different. This was a man. An act of will. And it could be stopped. He said nothing. He simply moved. His heavy boots made a soft thudding sound on the muddy ground as he stepped from the shadows of the trading post's overhang. The men parted for him, their eyes wide. Elias Kane rarely involved himself in the affairs of others. Blackwood watched him approach, a smirk playing on his lips, mistaking the woodsman's silence for simple-minded interest. "Ah, a buyer," he sneered. Elias stopped before him. His gaze was level, and his scarred face was an unreadable mask of stone. He did not look at Blackwood. He looked at the rope in Blackwood's hand. He reached into the leather pouch at his belt, his movement slow and deliberate. He pulled out 5 heavy silver dollars, coins he had earned through a summer of hard trapping, meant to see him through the winter. He held them out. The coins were dull in the fading light, but they seemed to absorb the weight of the entire moment. Blackwood's smirk widened. He snatched the coins, his fingers brushing against Elias's calloused palm. A man of few words. I like that. He dropped the rope into the mud at the woman's feet. She's all yours, friend. Do with her as you please. He swung himself onto his horse, turned the magnificent animal around, and rode away without a backward glance, the $5 silver a meaningless trifle in his pocket. He was gone. The transaction was complete. Elias stood there, the eyes of the entire trading post on him. He did not acknowledge them. He knelt, his knees sinking into the cold mud. He reached out and, with surprising gentleness, untied the knot that bound the woman's hands. Then he picked up the end of the rope. He did not pull it. He simply held it, a link between them. He stood up and looked at the shrouded head. He waited. After a long moment, she took a single, shuffling step. And then another. He turned and began to walk, away from the trading post, away from the prying eyes, toward the vast, silent embrace of the wilderness. She followed, a step behind him, a silent ghost drawn in the wake of a silent giant, the burlap sack a terrible mockery of a shadow. The journey to his cabin was a pilgrimage of silence. The path narrowed from a wagon-rutted track to a deer trail, winding deeper into the heart of the ancient forest. The air grew cleaner, scented with pine and damp earth. Elias walked with a steady, ground-eating pace, but he was acutely aware of the faltering steps behind him. He never looked back. To look back would be an accusation, a question she could not answer. He simply listened to the scuff of her worn shoes, the soft whisper of her breathing, the rustle of the sack against her shoulder. He was a bulwark against the wind for her, his broad back breaking the chill that swept down from the high peaks. The forest was his home, a place of solace, but he knew that for her, it could be just another cage, larger but no less frightening than the one she had just left. He felt the weight of her fear as if it were a pack on his own shoulders. They arrived as dusk bled the last of the color from the sky. The cabin was small, built by his own hands with the interlocking patience of a man who had nothing but time. It was nestled in a clearing, a plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney, a single square of warm, yellow light shining from its lone window. It was not a house. It was a haven. He pushed the door open and stood aside, holding the rope loosely. It was an invitation, not a command. She hesitated on the threshold, a dark shape against the dying light. The warmth from within washed over her, carrying the scent of wood smoke, dried herbs, and clean solitude. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, she stepped inside. The interior was sparse but immaculate. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. In one corner was a bed, neatly made. In the other, a small cot, piled with clean, thick blankets. He closed the door, shutting out the encroaching night. He dropped the rope to the floor, where it coiled like a dead snake. He crossed to the fireplace, added a log, and stoked the flames. He did not speak. He moved to the small kitchen area, ladling a thick, savory stew into a wooden bowl. He placed it on the table, along with a spoon and a cup of fresh water. Then he turned and looked at her, truly looked at the shrouded figure for the first time since the trading post. His gaze was not demanding, not pitying. It was just a quiet, steady acknowledgement of her presence. He gestured toward the table, then to the cot in the corner. "That is yours," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, a sound unused to the confines of a room. He picked up his own bowl of stew and a book, and settled into the chair furthest from her, by the fire, turning his back to give her the illusion of privacy. The first days were a delicate, unspoken treaty. He would rise before dawn, leaving a piece of bread and a cup of milk on the table before heading out to check his trap lines or chop wood. When he returned hours later, the food would be gone. He never saw her eat. He never saw her without the sack. She was a presence, a sliver of movement glimpsed from the corner of his eye, a faint sound of breathing in the night. She kept to the cot, a small island of misery in the quiet sea of the cabin. She watched him. From the shadows of her corner, through the suffocating weave of the burlap, she tracked his every move. She saw the way he mended a broken fence post with careful, efficient hands. She saw him speak softly to the mule that hauled his wood. She saw the deep lines of sorrow etched around his eyes when he stared too long into the fire at night. He was a man of immense strength, yet he moved with a gentleness that unnerved her. He never tried to speak to her. He never asked her to work. He never, ever, mentioned the sack. One afternoon, a week into their silent cohabitation, he returned to find a patch on his work shirt, a small, neat square of cloth stitched over a tear near the cuff. The stitches were tiny and perfect. He ran his thumb over them, feeling the care in the anonymous repair. He said nothing. The next day, he left a small, unwrapped bar of lilac-scented soap on the edge of her cot. It was a luxury he had bought for his wife years ago, a scent he associated with love and laughter. He didn't know why he did it. It was an impulse, a desire to offer her something soft in a world that had only shown her its jagged edges. That evening, as the wind howled outside, a wounded beast against the logs of the cabin, he thought he heard a new sound from her corner. It was not a sound of fear or of pain. It was a choked, broken sob, quiet and desperate, the sound of an ice floe finally cracking under the pressure of a long, frozen winter. He did not turn. He did not speak. He simply threw another log on the fire, offering her the privacy of its crackle and hiss. The first snow fell not as a gentle dusting, but as a sudden, thick curtain, dropping from a leaden sky and burying the world in white. It silenced the forest, muting every sound, trapping them together in the warm, close space of the cabin. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the fire, the howling wind, and the two of them, circling each other in a silent orbit of trauma and caution. The snow forced an intimacy they had both avoided. He could no longer work outside for the entire day. He spent his time indoors, mending his tools, carving small figures from scraps of pine, his hands never idle. She watched him, the constant, rhythmic scrape of his knife a soothing counterpoint to the storm outside. She saw that he was carving a bird, its wings outstretched in flight. The unveiling happened on the third night of the storm. The fire was burning low, casting long, wavering shadows across the room. Elias was cleaning his rifle, the methodical click and slide of metal on metal the only sound. He felt her gaze on him, more intense than usual. He did not look up. He continued his work, giving her the space she needed for whatever battle she was fighting within herself. Then, the sound of his work stopped. He had finished. An absolute silence descended, broken only by the breathing of two people in a room. Slowly, he looked up. She was standing by her cot, her back straight. Her hands, trembling slightly, rose to the base of her neck, to the leather thong that held her shame in place. His heart hammered against his ribs. He did not move. He did not breathe. He felt as if he were witnessing a sacred, terrifying rite. Her fingers fumbled with the knot, the rough leather resisting her efforts. He made a slight move to stand, to help, but stopped himself. This was her mountain to climb. He would not take it from her. Finally, the knot came free. With an agonizing slowness, she lifted the sack. The rough burlap slid up, over her hair, and was free. She held it in her hands, this shroud of her humiliation, and let it fall to the floor. For the first time, Elias saw her face. It was thinner than he had imagined, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. A purple and yellow bruise marred the side of her face, a cruel fingerprint left by Blackwood's world. But her eyes were a deep, clear grey, like a stormy sea, and they held not the brokenness he expected, but a fierce, guarded pride. They were the eyes of a survivor. Long, dark hair, matted from its confinement, fell around her shoulders. She was beautiful, not in a fragile way, but in the way of a storm-battered tree that still reached for the sky. He did not speak of her beauty or her bruises. He simply looked at her, and in his gaze, there was a profound and simple acceptance. He gave a single, slow nod. It was enough. "Elara," she said. Her voice was a dry whisper, a rustle of leaves, cracked from disuse. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He inclined his head. Elias, the sharing of names was a treaty signed. That night, she did not retreat to her cot. She sat in the other chair by the fire, a chasm of floorboards between them, and stared into the flames. Over the next few days, as the snow kept them bound together, her story emerged in broken fragments, pieces of a shattered life offered up like precious glass. She had been the daughter of a merchant, educated and proud. Silas Blackwood had courted her with poetry and promises, a charming serpent. Once he had her isolated from her family, the charm had evaporated, replaced by a cruel possessiveness. He'd squandered her father's money, ruined their name, and when he discovered she was with child, she had become an inconvenience to be discarded. The sack had been his final, depraved act of erasure. One evening, after a long silence, Elias rose and walked to the mantelpiece. He took down a small object and brought it back to the firelight. It was the wooden bird he had been carving, now smooth and finished. But next to it, he held another, smaller bird, this one blackened and charred, its form distorted by fire. "There was a fire," he said, his voice thick with unshed grief. "My wife, my daughter, Anna." He held the charred bird as if it were a holy relic. "She loved birds. I carved this for her the day before." He couldn't finish. He didn't need to. Elara looked from the scarred man to the scarred bird, and she understood. She understood the source of his silence, the depth of his kindness. He was not just a protector, he was a fellow survivor, a keeper of ghosts. She reached out, her fingers hesitating just above his calloused hand. It was not a touch, but the promise of one. In that small, shared space of firelight and profound loss, the first true seed of trust was planted, watered by the tears they did not shed. The thaw came slowly, then all at once. The world dripped and sighed, awakening from its white slumber. With the melting snow came a return to routine, but it was a new routine. Elara no longer hid in the corner. She moved about the cabin with a quiet purpose, cooking, mending, tending the fire. She spoke more, her voice gaining strength and clarity. They fell into a rhythm of shared tasks and comfortable silence, a domesticity that neither had expected. But as the land opened up, a deep, unspoken dread began to seep back in. The world was larger than their small clearing. And the world held monsters. The day it happened began with an unnatural stillness. The birds were quiet. The wind held its breath. Elias was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound, when he paused, head cocked. He had heard something, a sound that did not belong, the distant, steady beat of shod horses. He looked toward the tree line, his face grim. He knew. He had known this day would come. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked back to the cabin. Elara was kneading dough on the table, her face dusted with flour. She saw the look in his eyes and her hand stilled. She knew, too. He did not tell her to hide. He did not tell her to be afraid. He walked to an old wooden chest in the corner and lifted the lid. He pulled out a heavy, well-oiled rifle, his own, and a smaller, older axe, its handle worn smooth with use, its blade still sharp. He checked the rifle's load, then laid the axe on the table beside her. He did not say, "Use this." He did not say, "Defend yourself." His laying it there was a statement of fact, the threat is real, and you are not helpless. It was the greatest gift of trust he could give her. She looked at the axe, then at him. She wrapped her flour-dusted hands around its handle. Her knuckles were white, but her grip was firm. They did not have to wait long. 3 riders emerged from the forest, led by Silas Blackwood. He looked as smug and clean as he had at the trading post, flanked by 2 hired thugs who looked as if they had been assembled from mud and menace. They reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, trampling the first green shoots of spring. "Cain!" Blackwood called out, his voice dripping with condescending familiarity. "I've come for my property. I trust you've kept it in good condition." Elias stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely at his side. He stood there, a mountain of a man blocking the doorway. "She's not property," he said, his voice low and steady. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Oh, let's dispense with the pleasantries. I paid a man to track you. A good woodsman is hard to find, but not impossible for a man with deep pockets. I have a buyer for the girl, a man who doesn't mind her condition. She's worth far more than the pittance you paid. Now, stand aside. No, Elias said. The word was final. It hung in the air like a stone wall. Blackwood's face darkened. Then we'll do this the hard way, he nodded to his men. They dismounted, drawing long knives from their belts, and began to advance on the cabin. The world exploded into sudden, brutal motion. Elias fired the rifle once. Not at a man, but at the ground in front of them. It was a warning. They didn't heed it. The first thug rushed the porch. Elias met him not with the rifle, but with his own body. He moved with a speed that belied his size, a blur of controlled violence. A fist cracked against jawbone. The man crumpled. The second was more cautious, circling around. Blackwood remained on his horse, watching with an amused detachment, as if observing a dog fight. Elias was a whirlwind of fury, a protector unleashed. He fought with the desperation of a man who had already lost one family and would be damned before he lost another. He was skilled, but he was outnumbered. As he grappled with the second man, the first, recovering, scrambled to his feet and lunged at Elias from behind. Elias saw him too late. He braced for the blow. But it never came. There was a sickening thud and a cry of pain. Elias threw his opponent off him and spun around. Ilara stood there, on the porch, the axe in her hands. She had swung it not like a warrior, but like a woman chopping wood, a desperate, powerful arc of self-preservation. The flat of the axe head had caught the man square in the shoulder, sending him staggering back, his arm hanging uselessly. Her face was a mask of terror and fierce determination. In that moment, she was no longer a victim. She was his equal. Seeing his men dispatched, Blackwood's amusement curdled into rage. He drew a pistol from his coat, its silver inlay glinting in the sun. Incompetent fools, he snarled, aiming at Elias. But the momentary distraction was all Elias needed. He lunged forward, closing the distance in 2 great strides. He grabbed the pistol, twisting it from Blackwood's grasp and sending it flying into the mud. He hauled the sputtering man from his horse. Blackwood was nothing without his weapons and his wealth, just a soft, frightened man. Elias didn't hit him. He didn't need to. He held him by the collar, his scarred face inches from Blackwood's, and in his eyes, Silas Blackwood saw a promise of an end so complete, so desolate, that it was worse than death. Go, Elias rasped. And if you ever come back into this valley, I will not let you leave it. He released him, shoving him toward the forest. Blackwood stumbled, fell, and scrambled to his feet. He gave one terrified, hateful look back at the man and the woman standing together on the porch, then fled, his 2 wounded men stumbling after him, swallowed by the trees. Silence fell, profound and absolute. The only sounds were their own ragged breaths and the nervous stamping of Blackwood's abandoned horse. They stood together on the porch, Elias with his rifle, Ilara with her axe, watching the space where their tormentor had vanished. The danger had passed. They were bruised, bleeding, but they were alive. And they were victorious. They turned to each other. He saw the tremor in her hands as she lowered the axe. He reached out and gently took it from her, his fingers brushing hers. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze, a universe of understanding passed between them. All the walls, all the fear, all the history, crumbled into dust. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the aftermath of battle. He took a cloth and a basin of water and, with an infinite tenderness, began to clean the cut on her forehead where a stray splinter had caught her. His large, calloused hands, which could split a log or fell a man, were impossibly gentle. She did not flinch from his touch. When he was done, she took the cloth from him and began to tend to the bloody scrapes on his own knuckles. It was a quiet, intimate ritual, a baptism into their new reality. They were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a roof, they were partners, bound by shared trauma and a shared victory. When she finished, he did not let go of her hand. He held it, turning it over in his own, studying the lines on her palm as if it were a map to a new world. He looked at her, his gaze clear and deep, and he finally said the words that had been building in his heart since he'd first seen her, a shrouded figure of sorrow. "You'll never be alone again," he said. The words were a vow, a promise, a foundation stone for a future neither of them had dared to imagine. It was not a claim of ownership, but a declaration of sanctuary. Elara did not answer with words. She couldn't. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime and flour on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow or fear, but of profound, earth-shattering release. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his chest, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart. She was home. Later that evening, he took the burlap sack from the corner where it had lain forgotten. He did not look at it with hatred. He looked at it as a relic of a life that was now over. He walked to the fireplace and, without ceremony, laid it gently upon the glowing embers. They stood together, side by side, and watched it curl, blacken, and turn to ash. They watched her shame, her erasure, her past, disappear into smoke and float up the chimney, gone forever. When it was done, he went to the mantelpiece and took down the small, charred bird, the ghost of his daughter Anna. He pressed it into Elara's palm and closed her fingers around it. It was a passing of a torch, an offering of his most sacred pain, a belief that new life could grow from the ashes of the old. She clutched it to her heart, and in the warm, firelit cabin, two broken souls, scarred by the fires of their past, finally began to heal. Epilogue. Spring, 10 years later. The cabin was still there, but it had grown. A new room had been added, and a wide, welcoming porch wrapped around the front. A vegetable garden bloomed with vibrant life where trampled mud had once been. A boy of 9, with his father's quiet, observant eyes and his mother's determined chin, laughed as he chased a small, scruffy dog through the wildflowers. Elias sat on the porch steps, his hair now streaked with silver, the lines on his face softened by a decade of peace. He was carving a new bird, his hands moving with the easy grace of a man at peace with his world. The door opened and Elara emerged, carrying 2 cups of lemonade. The bruises were long gone, the haunted look in her eyes replaced by a warm, steady light. She handed him a cup and sat beside him, their shoulders brushing with comfortable familiarity. They watched their son, their legacy, a testament to the life they had built. Their home had become a sanctuary, not just for them, but for the handful of lost souls who had stumbled into their valley over the years, seeking refuge. They offered a warm meal, a safe bed, and the quiet strength of their example, asking for nothing in return. They had taken a moment of profound cruelty and spun it into a lifetime of profound kindness. True strength is not the power to control or to own, but the courage to protect and to shelter. It is the quiet resolve to stand in front of someone who cannot stand for themselves and say, no further. In a world that often feels cold and unforgiving, the greatest treasures are the safe harbors we build for one another, a warm fire, a steady hand, and the simple promise that you are not, and will never be, alone. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing for more tales of hope and the enduring power of the human spirit.